the art of educating older boys and girls. The change of teeth in a child is a gradual process, and even more gradual is the great transformation in the body, soul, and spirit, which I have already mentioned. Thus, in education, it is important to remember that children gradually change from imitative beings into those who look to the authority of an educator. Consequently, we should not make an abrupt transition in the way we treat children around their 7th year, the age when we receive them into elementary school. Anything else said about elementary education must be understood in the light of this principle. In the art of education with which we are concerned, it is important to foster the development of a child's inherent capacities. Thus, all teaching must be at the service of education. Strictly speaking, the task is to educate, and teaching is used as a means of educating. This educational principle requires that children develop the appropriate relationship to life at the right age. This can be achieved only if we do not begin by requiring children to act against their nature. For example, it is thoroughly unnatural to require children in the 6th or 7th year to simply copy the signs we use in this advanced stage of civilization for reading and writing. If you consider the letters we use for reading and writing, you will realize that there is no connection between these letters and what 7-year-old children do naturally. Keep in mind that when people first began to write, they used painted or drawn signs, and these copied objects or events in the environment. People also wrote from will impulses, so that the forms of writing expressed processes of the will. Cuneiform is an example. Footnote: cuneiform is composed of slim triangular or wedge-shaped elements, as the characters used in writing by the ancient Akkadians, Assyrians, Babylonians, Persians, and others. End of footnote. The completely abstract forms of letters that the eye must look at today arose from picture writing. If we confront young children with these letters, we present them with something alien that in no way suits their nature. Let us be clear about what it really means to force something foreign into a child's organism. It is as though we accustomed children from the earliest years to wearing clothes that are too small, clothes that do not fit and thus damage the organism. Today, observation tends to be superficial, and people fail to perceive the damage done to the organism merely by introducing reading and writing to children in a wrong way. An art of education based on knowledge of the human being proceeds truly by drawing out all that is in the child. It does not merely claim that an individual must be developed. It accomplishes this. And this is achieved first by not beginning with reading. With children, movements, gestures, and expressions of volition come first, not perception or observation. These come later. So we need to begin not with reading, but with writing. But this writing is the kind that will come naturally from the whole human being. Thus, we begin with writing lessons, not reading lessons, by leading into writing through what children do naturally, through imitation, through volition, through the hands. Let me make this clear through an example. Suppose we ask a child to say the word fish, for example, and while doing so, show her the form of the fish in a simple sketch. Then ask her to copy it, and in this way we get the children to experience the word fish. From fish we go to F, and from the form of the fish we can gradually evolve the letter F. Thus we derive the form of the letter through an artistic activity that carries what is observed into the will. In this way we avoid introducing an utterly alien F, something that would affect the child like a demon, as though something foreign were thrust into her body. Instead, we evoke something she has seen for herself in a grocery store, and we transform this little by little into F. This is how we can approach the way writing originated, since the way it arose is similar to this. But there is no need for teachers to study antiquity and reproduce the way picture writing arose, so that it can be given in the same way to children. It is necessary, however, to use living fantasy and to produce something fresh that leads from the object and the immediate life to the letters. You will then find the most varied ways of deriving the letters for children from life itself. For example, while you say let children feel how the sound vibrates on the lips. Then get them to see the shape of the lips as a form. Then you will be able to go gradually from the M vibrating on the lips to the letter M. In this way, if you proceed spiritually and imaginatively, not intellectually, you will gradually derive from the children's own activity everything needed to lead them to learn to write. They will learn to write later and more slowly than children usually do today. Parents may worry that their children are 8 or 9 years old and still do not yet write properly. And we must always let them know that when children learn more slowly at any given age, the material is absorbed in a more certain and healthy way by the organism than if it is forced into them. Moreover, there is room for the individuality of teachers, and this is an important consideration. Because we now have so many children in the Waldorf school, we have had to begin parallel classes. Thus we have 2 first classes or grades, 2 second classes, and so on. If you go into one of the first classes, you will see writing taught through painting and drawing. You can see how teachers are doing this. For example, it might be done just as described here. Then you go into the other first class, and you will find the same subject being taught. But you will see something very different. This teacher allows the children to run round in a kind of eurythmy, getting them to experience the form through their bodily movements. The shape that the child runs in is retained as the form of the letter, and it is possible to do this in a 3rd or a 4th way. You will find the same subject taught in extremely varied ways in different parallel classes. Why? Because it is not a matter of indifference that a teacher has a certain temperament. The lesson will be harmonious only when there is the right contact between a teacher and the whole class. Thus every teacher must present lessons as an individual. Just as life appears in manifold variety, so too teaching based on life will take various forms. Usually when educational principles are established, they are expected to be carried out. They are written down in a book, and a good teacher is expected to do them exactly, 1, 2, 3. I am convinced that if a dozen people, or even fewer, sit down together, they can produce the most wonderful program for education, 1st, 2nd, 3rd, and so on. People are so wonderfully intelligent these days, and I'm not being sarcastic, but really mean it. They can think out the most wonderful things in the abstract. But whether they can be put into practice is another matter. This is a concern of life. When we have to deal with life, isn't life, in all of you, natural life? You are all human beings, but you all look different. No one's hair is like that of another. Life displays variety in manifold forms. Each person has a different face. If you lay down abstract principles, you expect to find the same activities in every classroom. If your principles are taken from life, you know that life is varied, and that the same thing can be done in very different ways. You can see, for example, that Negroes are also regarded as human beings, yet in them the human form appears quite differently. In the same way, when the art of education is held as a living art, all slavish attention to rules and every sort of formalism must be avoided. Education will become real when it is made into a true art, and when teachers become artists. It is possible for us in Waldorf education to teach writing through art. Reading can be learned later, almost naturally and without effort. It comes later than is usual, but it comes almost on its own. While we are concerned with bringing the pictorial element to children, during the next few days I will show you some of the paintings from Waldorf School, we must also make sure that music is appreciated as early as possible. The musical element provides a good foundation for a strong, energetic will, especially at this age, if we emphasize not so much musical content as the rhythm and beat of the music. This is especially so if it is treated in the right way at the beginning of elementary school. I said in the introduction to the eurythmy performance that we should introduce eurythmy into children's education. Footnote: the performance took place August 18th at this conference. Steiner's introduction is in title An Introduction to Eurythmy. End of footnote. I will say more in a later lecture about eurythmy, particularly as it relates to education. For the moment, I wanted to give one or two more examples of how early instruction serves education, insofar as it is called from the nature of the human being. We must keep in mind that during the first part of the phase between the change of teeth and puberty, children cannot distinguish between what is inwardly human and what is external. Until the 8th or 9th year, these two aspects are still united. Inwardly, children feel a certain impression, while outwardly they may see a certain phenomenon, for example, a sunrise. They project the forces they feel inside when unhappy or suffering pain into the sun or moon or a tree or plant. And we should not reason children out of this feeling. Rather, we must transport ourselves into their stage of life and do everything in education as if no boundary existed yet between one's inner being and outer nature. We can do this only when we teach with as much imagination as possible, allowing plants to act in a human way by speaking with one another, and so on. We introduce humanity everywhere. People today have a horror of so-called anthropomorphism, but children who have not experienced this humanizing in relation to the world will lack something of humanity in later years. Teachers must be willing to enter the children's environment with their whole spirit and soul, so that children can go along with them on the strength of living experience. All of this implies that much will have happened to our teachers before they enter the classroom. The accomplishment of these educational principles places great demands on the preparation that teachers must do. As much as possible must be done ahead of time if teachers are to make the best use of their time in the classroom. Teachers learn to do this only gradually and with time, but it is only through this slow and gradual learning that teachers acquire a true regard for the individuality of children. May I speak of a personal experience in this connection? Years before my relationship with the Waldorf School, I had to deal with many forms of education. Thus it happened that when I was still young, I was charged with the education of a boy of 11 who was exceedingly backward in his development. Until then he had learned nothing at all. As proof of his achievements, I was shown an exercise book containing the results of the latest examination he had been forced into. All that could be seen there was an enormous hole he had made with an eraser, nothing else. In addition to this, the boy's domestic habits were pathological. The whole family was unhappy because of him, since they could not bring themselves to abandon him to a manual occupation, a social prejudice, if you like, but we must deal with such prejudices. So the whole family was unhappy. The family doctor was explicit that nothing could be done with the boy. So I was given all 4 children of this family to educate. The others were normal, and I was to educate this one along with them. I said that I would try. In such a case, one cannot make promises that something will be achieved. I decided to do everything within my power, but told them that I must have complete freedom in his education. His mother was the only member of the family who understood my stipulation for freedom, which meant that his education had to be fought for with the others. But ultimately the boy's instruction was left to me. It was necessary that the time spent in the boy's immediate instruction be as brief as possible. Thus, if I had to teach the boy for, say, about a half hour, I had to prepare for 3 hours, so that I could use the time most economically. Moreover, I had to carefully note the time of his music lesson. For example, because if the boy became overworked, he turned pale, and his health deteriorated. However, because I understood the boy's whole pathological condition, and because I understood the hydrocephalic condition, it was possible to make progress with the boy, and not just soul progress. Such was his progress that just 1.5 years after he had shown me merely a hole in his exercise book, he was able to enter high school. And I was able to help him further through his classes in high school and follow up with him until almost the end of his time there. Under the influence of this education, and also because everything was spiritually directed, the boy's head became smaller. I know that a doctor might say that his head may have become smaller anyway, certainly, but the right care of spirit and soul had to accompany that process. The person I've been speaking of later became an excellent doctor. He died during the war while performing his profession, though not until he was nearly 40 years old. It was especially important in this case to achieve the greatest economy of instruction, time, through the appropriate preparation. This must now become a general principle, and it is what we work for in the art of education I am talking about. When we teach by describing what we have to say to children in ways that arouse liveliness in their whole being, we must first master the subject thoroughly ahead of time. And we must be so at home with the material that we can direct all our attention and individual power to the form in which we present it. Then we discover naturally that all our teaching must become pictorial if children are to grasp it not just intellectually, but with their whole being. So we usually begin with stories such as fairy tales or made-up stories related to nature. We do not begin by teaching language or any other subject. We simply unfold the world itself in vivid pictures before the children. Such instruction is the best preparation for writing and reading, which will be derived imaginatively. Thus, between their 9th and 10th years, children come to express themselves in writing, and have learned to read as far as it is healthy at this age. We have now reached that important point in a child's life between the 9th and 10th years which I have already mentioned. You must realize that this important point in a child's life also manifests externally. A very remarkable change takes place, the differentiation between girls and boys. I will speak later about the significance of this for a co-educational school such as ours. In the meantime, we must bear in mind that the differentiation between boys and girls does take place. Thus, around the 10th year, girls begin to grow more quickly than do boys. Growth in boys is held back, and girls overtake them in growth. When children reach puberty, the boys again catch up with the girls, and the boys begin to grow more quickly. Between the 10th and 15th years, the outer differences between girls and boys indicate that a significant phase of life has been reached. Inwardly, a clear distinction between oneself and the world appears. Before this time there was no such thing as a plant, only a green thing with red flowers in which there is a little spirit, just as there is a little spirit in us. With plants, such things do not make sense to children until around the 10th year. Here we must be able to follow their feeling. Thus, only when children reach this age is it correct to teach them about the external world of our surroundings. One can begin, for example, with botany, a great standby for schools. But particularly in the case of botany, I can show how one should conduct a formal education, in the best sense of the word. It is completely unnatural to begin by showing children a single plant, because it is not a whole. A plant is not whole, especially when it has been taken from the ground. In our age of realism and materialism, people have little sense for what is material and natural. Otherwise they would have a feeling for what I have just said. Is a plant whole? No. Once we pull it from the earth and bring it here, it quickly withers. It is not natural to be pulled up. Its nature is to be in the earth with the soil. A stone is complete in itself. It can lie anywhere, and it makes no difference. But I cannot carry a plant all over the place. It will change. Its nature is complete only in conjunction with the soil and the forces that spring from the earth, along with all the sun's forces that fall on this particular piece of earth. Together with these, the plant makes a totality. To view a plant in isolation is absurd. It's like pulling a hair out of one's head and regarding the hair itself as complete. A hair arises in connection with an organism and cannot be understood apart from that organism. Therefore, when teaching botany, we must not begin with the plant or plant family, but with the landscape and geography. We must begin with an understanding of what the earth is like in a particular place. The nature of plants must be treated in relation to the whole earth. When we speak of the earth, we generally speak as physicists, or at most as geologists. We assume that the earth is a self-enclosed totality of physical mineral forces, and that its existence would be no different if there were no plants, animals, or people at all. But this is an abstraction. The earth, as viewed by the physicist or geologist, is an abstraction. There is, in fact, no such thing. In reality, there is simply the earth covered with plants. We must be aware that when our description is purely geological, it is only for the convenience of our intellect, and that we are describing a non-existent abstraction. We must not start by giving children an idea of this non-existent abstraction. Rather, we must give them a realization of the earth as a living organism, beginning, of course, with the area that the children know. If children know nothing of an animal, we would not show them just a hair. We would show them animal with hair growing on it. Similarly, we must begin by giving children a vivid realization of the earth as a living organism, and then show them how plants live and grow on the earth. The introduction to the animal kingdom is entirely different and comes a little later. Again, to describe the single animals is inorganic. Indeed, it could almost be said that it is pure chance that a lion is a lion and a camel a camel. A lion, presented to a child's contemplation, will seem arbitrary, no matter how well it is described, or even if it is seen in a menagerie. It is the same with a camel. Observation alone makes no sense in the area of life. Thus, the study of plants follows naturally from introducing the earth to children as a living organism, beginning with a particular region. To consider one part of the earth at a time, however, is also an abstraction, since no region can exist apart from the other regions. We should be aware that this involves beginning with something incomplete. In any case, if we teach with images and appeal to the wholeness of children's imagination, they will be alive to what we tell them about plants. In this way, we gradually introduce children to the external world. They gain a sense of objectivity and begin to live into reality. We do this by introducing children in a natural way to the plant kingdom. But how are we to regard animals? Anyone who can contemplate animals with imaginative vision instead of abstract intellect finds that each animal is a portion of the human being. In one animal, the leg development predominates, whereas they are at the service of the whole organism in human beings. In another animal, the sense organs, or a particular sense organ, is developed in an extreme way. One animal will be specially adapted for smell, another for seeing from high in the air. When we look at the whole animal kingdom, we find that the external, abstract divisions of the animal kingdom together make up the human being. All the animals taken together synthetically represent a single human being. Each capacity or group of faculties in the human being is expressed in a one-sided way in an animal species. When we study an animal, there is no need to explain everything to children. We can show them in simple pictures. When we study lions, for example, we find particularly overdeveloped heart and chest organs. Cows show a one-sided development of the digestive system. And when I examine the white corpuscles of human blood, I see an indication of the earliest, most primitive creatures. The whole animal kingdom together is a synthesis of the human being, not symptomatically, but synthetically woven and interwoven. I can explain all of this to children in a simple, primitive way. Indeed, I can make it very vivid when speaking, for instance, about the lion's nature and showing how it needs to be calmed and subdued by the human individuality. Or we can take the moral and soul characteristics of the camel, showing how the camel presents in a lower form what we find in human nature. The human being is a synthesis of lion, eagle, ape, camel, cow, and all the rest. We can view the whole animal kingdom as human nature divided up and spread out. So, this is the other side that children get during their 11th or 12th year. After they have learned to separate themselves from the plant world, to experience objectivity and a connection with an objective earth, they then learn of the close connection between animals and human beings, the subjective side. Thus the universe is again connected with the human being through feelings. In this way we educate children through contact with life in the world. Thus we find that the requirements we establish are met spontaneously. In theory, we can keep saying that we must not overload the memory. It is not good to burden children's memory, and anyone can see that in the abstraction. Read that again. It is not good to burden children's memory, and anyone can see that in the abstract. It is more difficult to see clearly how an overburdened memory affects a person's life. It means that later in life the person suffers from rheumatism and gout. It is a pity that medical observation does not cover the whole span of a life. But in fact we find many people who are afflicted with rheumatism and gout to which they had no predisposition. Or perhaps a slight predisposition was increased because the memory was overtaxed, because one was forced to learn too much from memory. On the other hand, the memory must not be neglected, because if the memory is not exercised enough, inflammatory conditions of the physical organs are likely to arise, particularly between 16 and 24. So how can we maintain a balance between burdening the memory and neglecting it? When we teach with images and with imagination, as I have described, children take as much instruction as they can bear. A relationship arises like that between eating and being satisfied. This means that we will have some children who are more advanced than others, and we must deal with this without placing less advanced children in a lower class. We may have a relatively large class, and yet a child will not eat more than is bearable spiritually, because the organism spontaneously rejects what a child cannot bear. Thus here we consider life, just as we draw our teaching from life. Children are able to take in the elements of arithmetic at a very early age, but in arithmetic we can see how easy it is to give an intellectual element to children too early. Mathematics per se is not alien to anyone at any age. It arises from human nature. The principles of mathematics are not foreign to human nature, as letters are foreign in a succeeding civilization. It is exceedingly important, however, that children be introduced to arithmetic and mathematics in the right way. And this can really be determined only by those enabled to oversee the whole of human life from a certain spiritual standpoint. Arithmetic and moral principles are two things that in terms of logic seem very removed from each other. It is not common to connect arithmetic with moral principles because the logical connection is not obvious. It is obvious, however, to those who do not view the matter in terms of logic, but in a living way, that children who are introduced to arithmetic correctly will have a very different feeling of moral responsibility than those who were not. Now, what I am about to say may seem like an extreme paradox to you, but since I am speaking of realities and not of the illusions of our age, I will not fear the seemingly paradoxical. For these days, truth often seems paradoxical. If people had known how to permeate the soul with mathematics in the right way during these past years, we would not now have Bolshevism in Eastern Europe. One perceives the forces that connect the faculty used in arithmetic with the springs of morality in humankind. Perhaps you will understand this better if I give you a little illustration of the principles behind teaching arithmetic. Today it is common to begin arithmetic by adding one thing to another. But just consider how alien it is to the human mind when we add one p to another and with each addition specify a new name. The transition from 1 to 2 and then to 3, such counting is an arbitrary activity for the human being. It is possible, however, to count in a different way. We find this when we go back a little in human history. Originally, people did not count by adding one p to another and deriving a new thing that, for the soul anyway, had little to do with what came before. Rather, people counted more or less as follows. It was their view that everything in life can always be grasped as a whole, and the most diverse things might constitute a unity. If I have a number of people in front of me, that can be a unity at first. Or if I have an individual before me, that person is a unity. A unity in reality is purely relative. Now, I keep this in mind as I count in this way, and there's a picture. In other words, I take an organic whole, a whole consisting of members. I begin with unity. And in that unity, viewed as a multiplicity, I seek the parts. This, in fact, was the original view of number. Unity was always a totality, and one looked for the parts in the whole. One did not think of numbers as arising from the addition of 1 and 1 and 1. Rather, one conceived of the numbers as belonging to a whole and proceeding organically from that whole. When we apply this to teaching arithmetic, we get the following. Instead of placing one bean after another for children to see, we give them a whole pile of beans. The bean pile constitutes a whole, and we begin with this. Next, with our pile of beans, or a pile of apples, if you think it might appeal more to their imagination, we explain that there are 3 children of various ages who need different amounts to eat. We want to do something that might apply to real life. So what shall we do? We could, for example, divide the pile of apples so that we have one pile on the one hand and on the other 2 portions that together equal to the first pile. The whole pile represents the sum. We have a pile of apples and we say, here are 3 parts, and we get the children to see that the sum equals the 3 parts. In other words, in addition, we do not go from the parts and arrive at the sum. We begin with the sum and proceed to the parts. Thus, to get a living understanding of addition, we begin with the whole and proceed to the addenda, or parts. Addition is concerned essentially with the sum and its parts, the members contained one way or another in the sum. This is how we get children to enter life with the ability to grasp the whole, rather than always proceeding from less to more. This has a very powerful influence on a child's whole soul and mind. Once children have acquired the habit of adding things together, a predisposition arises that tends to be desirous and craving. By proceeding from the whole to the parts, on the other hand, and by treating multiplication in a similar way, children are less prone to acquisitiveness. Instead, they tend to develop, in the noblest Platonic sense, consideration and moderation. Our moral likes and dislikes are intimately connected with the way we learned to deal with numbers. At first sight, it's difficult to see any logical connection between one's approach to numbers and moral ideas. Indeed, those who look at things only from the intellectual point of view may laugh at the idea of a connection. It may seem absurd to them. It is also easy to understand that people may laugh at the idea of going from the sum in addition instead of from the parts. When one sees the true connections in life, however, the things that seem most remote logically become exceedingly close. Consequently, the processes that take place in the souls of children through working with numbers have a tremendous effect on the way they meet us when we wish to present them with moral examples and actions intended to evoke sympathy for good and antipathy toward evil. We will see children who are open to goodness if we have taught them numbers as described.